And I'll explain why I dithered when David asked me to come. It wasn't I was trying to figure out an excuse for not being here, I promise you. The previous year, we had planned to go to Portsmouth, where my mum lives, for Christmas. The pastor there normally takes the first week of the year as his study leave, so he'd asked me to preach for him on the Sunday, the first Sunday of the year, and we were all set to go. We left here, got to Cardiff to drop off Christmas presents to my daughter there and her family, and that night the Welsh government decided to put the country into lockdown, and all strangers were told to leave the country immediately. We thought, we'll go to Portsmouth anyway and stay with Mum anyway. And within an hour or two, the government had decided to put Portsmouth, for all of its wonderful football team, into Tier 4. So we weren't allowed to go into Portsmouth. We weren't allowed to stay in Wales. The ferries from Wales to Ireland were already off. And the Scottish government was talking about arresting anyone who came across the border into Scotland. So I was talking about this on Sunday, saying I was kind of between a rock and a hard place, and we decided to come home. And I felt really bad about not doing the Sunday in Portsmouth, and ended up agreeing to do it online by Zoom, then finding they couldn't do the technology, and so had to record it and email it over to them. So that was how last year worked. So this year we were to go over to Portsmouth again, spend Christmas with my mum, and preach on the first Sunday, which was 2 days ago in Portsmouth. So when the phone call came, I was trying to think, if we are preaching on Sunday and I leave on Monday morning early and drive up to Cairnryan, what kind of state am I going to be in on Tuesday? Probably the same as ever. Then I got a message from the folk in Portsmouth to say the pastor's wife had been ill, possibly MS that she has, so he was not going to do his study leave this week. And did I mind not going to preach for him this Sunday and do it in July instead? So that left me free to say yes. So I came home last Friday, and I'm more or less awake now, and looking forward to being with you for these 2 or 3 days. David very kindly made comments about my last time with you 2 years ago. My memory of it was thinking, those are far too long. I should have been a bit briefer and allowed more time for prayer and conversation afterwards. So the theory is that I'm a bit shorter tonight, and we'll have more time to pray and converse together. And I want to do the book of Ruth with you. So if you have a Bible, you can look up the first chapter of Ruth that we'll have a look at this evening. And those of you who have plenty of foresight and knowledge will say, how on earth is he going to do the whole of 4 chapters of Ruth in 3 nights and still get us out of here in time to get home before the roads are blocked with snow? Well, I'm not going to attempt to expound every full stop and comma in the book. When Dave phoned me, he doesn't know this yet, but I was actually preaching a series in Carrick, Fergus at the time, on the book of Ruth. And I had taken it as being an illustration of Ruth under God's hand transitioning from her old normal into a new normal. And it's a series I felt was appropriate at that time in their experiences as a church, and for us together in changeful days in which we live. So this is being dead candid, right? My instant reaction was, those sermons I did in Carrick would do rightly for Ballinhinch then, and it's a kind of suitable theme to start the year off on, how to transition into a new year. Smashing. But I've never really liked preaching a series of sermons over again. I always like to go back to scratch. So I started to go back to scratch and thought, actually, the book is useful in terms of seeing it through the eyes of Naomi. If you know Ruth at all, as I'm sure most of you do, the first chapter, and we'll be making reference to it later, sees Naomi describing herself as being bitter. And by the end of the book, we find Naomi sweet, blessed by God with a grandson she never thought she'd have. And that movement in her life, as she trusted and rested in God, would be a useful way of looking at the book. And then I thought again, and I thought actually the book is quite interesting, looking at it from God's point of view. And as I read through it again and again, I came to the conclusion, if you look at the book, as we will do over these 3 nights, God willing, the first chapter focuses our mind on how God handles their past. And I'll be saying he alludes to that past, and we'll develop that theme a bit in a moment. And then chapters 2 and 3 show God responding, how God responds to their present situation to get back in the land. How does God work in their lives in the present? And then the 4th chapter points the finger forward as this child born to Boaz and Ruth becomes the father of Obed, Jesse, and ultimately of David, and finally of the Messiah himself. So God's perspective on the past, the present, and the future were 3 headings for 3 nights. That sounded not only handy from a preacher's point of view, but I believe blessed from God. I trust that how I've been blessed during these days of preparation will come to you as well. So that's how we're handling the book. Let me read the first chapter with you. And as I read it, you can think of our theme as how does God handle their past? And I'm saying he alludes to it. And I'll try and explain that as we go through. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and his 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of the people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she'd been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight, and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you will go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. And so Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. And that is God's word, and we know He will touch our hearts through its message this evening. This is one of the books of the Old Testament that has no direct word from God recorded in it. There's no prophet who speaks to people God's word in the course of this book. There's no priest who reminds them of God's word spoken in the present or the past. No angel giving a divine message. No direct voice of God himself recorded in the course of this book. And yet, as I'm going to suggest to you, the whole book is God's writing. It's what God calls someone to write down in order to reveal himself through the history and experiences of these human beings. It is suggested that the most likely author of the book from the human standpoint is Samuel. The book is set between the end of the Judges and the first part of the book of Samuel. And you're all experts on 1st and 2nd Samuel, having gone through those books of recent days. So if I want to have a quiz at the end, you'll have all the answers for me. And Samuel would have been the person who had a leading role in the nation and could well have actually written this at God's behest. But it would have been at God's behest, writing what God wanted to reveal about himself through the experiences of these folk. And today, as we look to the past, especially in these opening few verses, I want to kind of stress what God does with their past. And I've picked the word allude. There's probably better words, but it's the only one that came to my mind. God alludes to their past. So he puts on record in the book various references to some of the big things that were happening nationally and personally in the lives of these folks. As God does so, alluding to the past, he avoids the two dangers that face us as believers, indeed just face us as human beings, when we start to think about the past, as we're bound to do at the start of a new year. Danger number one is trying to ignore the past, forget the past, pretend it never happened. And poor Paul, who wrote in terms of forgetting that which is behind and pressing on towards the mark of the prize, the high calling of God in Christ Jesus, gets terribly misquoted on that. Oh, don't talk about the past. Just bury it. Forget about it. Airbrush it out of existence. I don't want to remember the past. And there's that danger in us as human beings. We want to ignore and therefore not learn from or grow through what has happened in our past. Danger number 2, the opposite, is that we wallow in our past. We allow it to cast its shadow over us and become enslaved to it for the rest of our lives, especially if that past has been particularly traumatic or difficult. I'll not say which the church I served this relates to, wouldn't be fair to tie it down, but I had in one church a dear, dear soul, and she, every time I visited her over a long period of time, would tell me about the time when her business was attacked, her and her husband's business had been attacked, how then it had been threatened, how then it had been bombed, how then after a while he had bad health and then he died. And I had every detail of his demise given to me every single time I met her. And not only me, but every member of the church would get exactly that same little chunk of her history. Part of you went out heart and soul after her. You felt, here's somebody whose trauma at that moment in her life had been so traumatic that 30 years later, she's still living it every single day of life. She can't just get it out of her soul and out of her spirit. Part of you wanted to wring her neck. I'd say, hang on a minute, that was years ago. Start living today. There's new days and new opportunities and new relationships. So don't let the past enslave you. But those are 2 ways we tend to swing in life, isn't it? We either want to airbrush out the past because it's too painful to remember, or we want to wallow in the past and never let it go. And what I want to say tonight is that God does neither. He alludes to the past. He makes references to it. And those are ones I want to go through in a moment. But not in vast detail, not to hang it over the heads of Naomi and her kith and kin. But in a sense, a reminder that he is the God of the past, the God who was working through all the ups and downs of their lives. So if you have a Bible, you can run through with me. Here are the little pointers from history that he alludes to, and he doesn't expand on them at all. Verse 1 is a time of the judges. Verse 1, there's a famine in the land. Still in verse 1, a man, his wife, and his sons left Bethlehem, and they're not even named there initially. And the fourth one, verse 1, they went to Moab. Go to verse 3, and God makes a reference to the fact, he alludes to that historic moment when Elimelech died in Moab. Then in verse 4, his sons married Moabite women. Verse 5, 10 years later, both sons died in Moab. Verse 6, God provides fresh supplies in Israel, and so Naomi decides to go back. So that's a kind of tenor, especially those first few verses of the whole chapter. God alludes to historic moments in their lives without expanding them in great detail. But those who read them, maybe for us some of those things don't sound very big at all, but for those who read them, they'd have understood how significant each of these moments were. It was a time of the judges. Nothing more said. But the people in Israel in that day and in days to come would have known something of the significance of God talking to them about this being the days of the judges. It wasn't just a historical record to say, if you want to slot this into chronology, it was at that point in time or history. This was about the spirit, the temperature, the spiritual compass in Israel at that point in time. God had brought them out of Egypt through the wilderness into the promised land. He had set before them a clear choice that he wanted to be their God as their focus of worship and their king as their ruler and director of life. Jehovah only to be worshipped, Jehovah only to be king. And it hadn't been, as it were, 5 minutes in the promised land before everyone started to do what was right in their own eyes and started to worship some of the pagan idolatrous stuff that was left them by the Canaanites. They failed to worship God only as king. They failed to worship Jehovah as God. They failed to allow God to be their king. And the result of that was that the cycle of events goes round and round and round, that God chastises them, they come to their senses, they acknowledge their sin and failure, God sends a judge to deliver them out of that mess, and then it's back to saying to Israel, come on, I'm your king. Let me be the one who rules and directs you. And that sad cycle hardly ever seemed to end. So what we're saying here is that God alludes to that. He doesn't expand in great detail. He doesn't sort of shake the finger at them and say, those were the days where you really messed up bad and you were hopeless failures, and sort of really rhyme off how disappointed God had been to have a people in the promised land who failed to worship him only as God and failed to obey him only as king. There was a famine in the land. And you could quickly flick past that, couldn't you? Well, there's lots of famines in lots of countries, especially in the Middle East and beyond. But God alludes to it here. Why? Because the famine in the land was part of his chastisement of a people who were rebelling against him. This was the promised land. This was Canaan. This was the land flowing with milk and honey. This was the land in which God had promised they wouldn't be hungry. And yet a famine in Bethlehem, which means the house of bread. And so the real reason why God alludes to it is that here's a moment in time when he needed to chastise his people and needed to learn from that. He doesn't go off the deep end with them now. He just reminds them of that moment in history. Back to verse 1 again. A man and his wife and his sons left Bethlehem. Well, that's sense, isn't it? That's a man caring for his family. If there's no bread, you go somewhere else where there's bread. I think from God's point of view, that was never the case. If chastisement is needed for the nation by way of a famine, then God doesn't expect people to emigrate and find somewhere else to eat. He expects them to learn the lesson and stay put until the lesson's been learnt and the deal's been done between them as a people and their God. They went to Moab, verse 1. I'm always tempted to say one man went to Mo and the other went to Moab, but that's just my crazy sense of humour. But they went to Moab. And again, what's God alluding to? He's alluding to the fact that Moab was the country that developed out of the immoral behaviour of Lot's daughters with their father. It was the nation which constantly opposed Israel and God's plans and purposes for them. It was the last of the nations before they crossed over the River Jordan who wouldn't even give Israel bread or water on their journey. And as a result, God had threatened them as a nation, the Moabites, and said that if any of them ever came into Jerusalem or came into the promised land in the days to come, they would never have a resting place for 10 generations. They were under God's judgment. As you go through the Old Testament, you find that of all the nations around them, it's the Moabites that Israel's told, don't intermingle with them. Don't let your daughters marry their sons or vice versa. They are pagan and idolatrous in their behavior, and they will infiltrate the nation of Israel if you do it. So you can understand what God is saying very gently. When he says this was a time of the judges, there was a famine in the land, a man and his sons and daughters left to go to Moab. And then once in Moab, a tragedy. This is the kind of great irony that God is pointing to here, that the man who leaves Bethlehem to save his life and protect his family loses his life and loses his sons in Moab and gets buried in Moab. And I'm not sure how attached you are to where you get married, where you get buried. I certainly know great longings, nothing in my will written to say I must be buried back in Cornwall, even if Cornwall is the nearest place to the promised land, the side of heaven. I really don't care where my bones are. But in that Eastern world, and particularly that time, there's a big deal. And there was a sense, remember how they brought Joseph's bones up from Egypt to bury them in the promised land. It was a way of saying, I have a stake in the promised land. This matters to me. It's part of God's promise to me and to my descendants. And so while God doesn't make a big deal of it in these words, his references to Elimelech and his sons dying and being left behind in Moab is particularly poignant. So what I'm saying to you is just simply, that's how God deals with these big deals from the past. He's not raking it up to make them feel bad, but neither is he trying to airbrush them out of reality. There's things that he says about those moments in their lives that I believe God himself trusts will shape their aspirations and their behavior for the days to come. To rub that in, we look at the contrast. How does Naomi handle her past, which is the rest of the chapter? And I suggest that Naomi is overwhelmed by her past. Most of our translations are very mild translations of what Naomi actually says. And there are other things we'll say tomorrow night where the translators are quite restrained as well, the opposite way around. Let me read out those verses to you. Verse 13, this Naomi, the one who's been through all those experiences, and verse 13, the Lord's hand has turned against me. Verse 20, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. Verse 21, I went away full. When you think about that, that's an odd thing to say about a family who left Bethlehem because of the famine. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Second part of verse 21, the Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. And if you look at a very, very modern translation or something like the Message, you'll find that it can be translated, the Lord slapped me across the face. It's very, very stark language. And so commentators have quite a difficulty handling it. What's she saying? On the one hand, I deserved what God did to me. God's been tough on me. He's been hard on me. He's broken my heart. He's given me a tough calling in life, but I deserved it. Or she's saying the opposite. She's saying that she deserved better. And I think that most of the honest commentators go for the second one. That the spirit of her attitude and her language is that she felt that God could and should have treated her more kindly. She's complaining about God. Those desperate experiences she's had. And there's that in her which says that God hasn't been fair to me. God hasn't dealt with me as well as he might have done. God has left me bitter. And what we're simply saying is that's not the way to handle our past. God alludes to those moments, but he doesn't allow them or use them to captivate his people into a prison from which they can't escape. The whole book will actually demonstrate how God takes those past incidents. I'm running ahead to to Thursday, should I say, a bit, but God takes those very things and he weaves them into the tapestry of his ultimate purposes. So he's not encouraging them to do bad stuff, but he is saying, we don't airbrush it out. And I'm a God who's big enough to handle what you do as my people, good, bad, or indifferent. So how does that handle for you and me tonight as we start a new year together? My guess is that when I mention the past, that'll mean different things for each person in the room tonight. For some, it might mean the experiences of bereavement or illness in very recent weeks or months have gone past. Very recent past, very vivid past, very painful past. Maybe it'll be slightly broader than that, and you hear the word your past, and what comes to mind is the impact of the pandemic on church life, on family life, on your business life, on your relationships, on finances, on your career, on your study, whatever. And you think about this past couple of years and how do you handle it? Think, oh, that was so bad, I just want to airbrush it out to reality, or so awful, I just have to keep on telling the pastor over and over and over again how difficult it's been for me. Maybe think of the past and it's in your heart and mind some of the hurts of life, some of the crisis either in individual lives or your life as a church, which you find hard to put on the back burner anymore. Isn't it true that many people start every new year with a bucket load of regrets, if onlys? In fact, the very notion of New Year's resolutions, when you think about that phrase, means there's stuff I wish I hadn't done, or there's things that I should have done. It reinforces that sense that what happened last year wasn't as good as it ought to be. And the past is weighing heavily on my mind. I saw on one Instagram page of a friend I have, and she put it this way, she said, I don't have any New Year's resolutions to make ever. All I do is remember the good stuff from last year and ask for the same again. Not too bad. She's not a Christian, and that's probably as close you're to get. But it seems to me there's a real blessing in handling our past as God does rather than as Naomi does. Not pretending those things didn't happen. Not pretending we weren't really hurt. Not pretending that we weren't disappointed, that we weren't frustrated, that we weren't angry at the time. Nor allowing that to weigh us down so we can't make a fresh start for the future. What a blessing if we handle the past as God does, alluding to it, even in prayer, without allowing ourselves to be shackled by the past and bear that burden heavy on our hearts. So I want to suggest as we close this evening a few areas of prayer as we come together, and then I'll ask Dave for maybe particular prayer topics that relate to yourselves as a church family. I thought, first of all, of gratitude to God for how he's overruled our troubled pasts, whether that's personally, individually, as a family, as a church family, as a community of God's people here. It is remarkable how God has made us as human beings capable of going through some of the darkest things in life and yet coming out the other side. And we thank God for those times when we've come out the other side. Secondly, intercession for those who are weighed down by the past. There's folk that you know, perhaps you might be one of them yourselves, but people you know in your circle of friends or neighbours, people in our society as a whole, who are simply bogged down by the past and to keep it alive and never move on. Easy to criticise them, but today I suggest we should be praying for them and for our whole province in that regard. I think we could ask God for grace to learn from the past. We don't dare brush it out and pretend it didn't happen. But we say, Lord, what do you wanted to teach me through that? What was your underlying plan, Lord, in that? I can't see it myself. But Lord, give me grace to learn from the past. And lastly, let's use our time of prayer to affirm our trust in God, to use the past for his honour, his glory, and for our good.